This conference will now be recorded.
So welcome to this webinar where we are going to talk about reactive programming with RxJS and Angular. So before I get started with the webinar, I want to introduce myself. My name is Alan Chotarl, or just Al, and I'm a Google developer expert in web technologies, more specifically focused on Angular. My background is that I started a long time ago with software development. I was a Java developer at the beginning, and then I got into AngularJS in 2011. And since then, I've been working with Angular on a daily basis, basically. And what I do is that I'm a web consultant 60% of the time, and I do technical training in person or remotely with webinars, conferences, video courses about 40% of the time. I'm based in Sacramento, California, where I'm the organizer of the Google Developer Group Sacramento, as well as the Angular Meetup Group. So today we are going to talk about reactive programming with RxJS and Angular. And the first very important thing to know about reactive programming with Angular is that it relies on a library called RxJS. And that library brings a specific kind of object to the table called the observable. These observable objects, they provide support for passing messages between publishers and subscribers in the application. So this is something that we are going to see all over the place when you build and when you work with Angular applications. This notion of subscriber publisher is very important. It brings a lot of benefits to our code because everything we are going to do in the browser is going to be asynchronous. And we're going to have to listen to multiple different events, and these events could happen at any time. So the idea is that we are going to implement a mechanism where our components or our services are going to subscribe to data sources, and then these data sources are going to publish data over time, and our components are going to react to those updates by rendering the data as needed. So that's why it is called reactive programming. We basically set our components so that they become passive in a way. They subscribe to a source, that source publishes data, the components react and render that data. So this library, RxJS, that brings observables to the table is not specific to Angular. It is actually an implementation of reactivex.io. So reactivex.io is the official website for the Reactive X library, and RxJS is the JavaScript implementation for it. So that's where the RxJS letters comes from. And so ReactiveX can be used with Java, it can be used with PHP, Python, many different languages. Of course, in our case, we are working in the browser, so we are using the JavaScript implementation. So Angular itself uses observables everywhere. So it's a very important part of the framework. And they're used by multiple services. So if you use the router in your Angular application, there's a way to subscribe to URL changes in the browser, and this is using observables. There's a way to subscribe to form changes. So if you have a form with multiple different inputs, you can also use observables to subscribe to that and get notified when a user changes something in that form. And the most common use case, the one that happens with pretty much every single application, is HTTP requests, because we are building front-end applications running in the browser, which means that we are going to get some data from a server. And in order to get that data, we're going to make an HTTP request. And the HTTP client from Angular is based on RxJS observables. So whenever we make an HTTP request with that client, what it gives us is an observable object. So an observable is perfect to listen to a stream of events. That's really the idea. We subscribe to a data source, and then we are going to get a lot of different events, a lot of different data over time. So a very common way to represent observables is to use a timeline, such as the one we see here on my screen. And that timeline shows us the different sets of data that have been emitted over time. So this simple observable emitted 1, 2, 3, 4, a little bit later on 5, and then completed. So that's really the basics of observables. So I'm going to show you a first example of code that makes use of observables. So let's go to my IDE. And what we are going to take a look at is this component here. So that's a component that injects a service called post service. And what it does with that service is that it is calling a getPost method that returns an observable. And then once we have that observable, what we do is we subscribe to it, because that's really the key to using observables. With that subscription, every time we get new data, this callback function is going to run. And when it runs, so post is a parameter that is going to be passed to that callback function. And what I do with that post is that I push it to an array of posts. So this component is going to display a list of social media posts. So you can think as a data source that would display, that would get Facebook, Twitter, Instagram posts and just render them on the screen. So that's all my component does. It gets that service, subscribes to it, and is going to store all of the posts in an array. So the array is defined right here. That's an array of posts where the data is going to be pushed. Now, if we take a look at the template for that component, we can see that it is basically a div that we are going to repeat for every single post of our list, which means every time a new post gets added to the array, this ng-for loop is going to re-render and add a new post to what shows up on the screen. So let's take a look at what it actually looks like. So I'm going to open this example on the screen. So it's running on my machine locally, and I have a small server that serves fake posts data. So I go to my example. You can see the component shows up, and that component is going to subscribe to posts and receive data as it gets emitted. So let's see. I don't see anything show up yet. Oh, I got an error here. Let's make sure that my server is running. And retry. Oh, I'm not running the right server, that's why. So post server.js is the one that's going to serve my posts. Now I can refresh. And my component is going to subscribe to my service, and the service is going to get posts over time. So that's the first one that got pushed to my component, and then a second one, and a third one, and a fourth one, and now they keep going. We are subscribed to this. You can see that the component is reactive and it keeps displaying the data as it happens. So how does this work? How does this observable get the data and displays it on the screen? So if we go back to our code, we'll see that there is a service involved in this. So let's go to the service. And the service is using this RxJS library. More specifically, it is using the RxJS WebSocket module from RxJS. And we are importing a WebSocket function. That WebSocket is going to establish a two-way connection between our JavaScript code and the server side. So this is what I do here: WebSocket connection to WS column / lowest 8000. And this creates a WebSocket subject. So that's an object from the RxJS framework that we can turn into an observable. So you can see that my getPosts method here returns an observable of post. And I just return my WebSocket as an observable. And on the other hand, my component is going to subscribe to that. So I'm just subscribing to WebSocket. And from there, my server just adds and generates these posts randomly, pushes them to the WebSocket, and my service is subscribed to it, gives an observable to the component, and the component gets the data. So that's how this reactive code actually works. And it is very little code in the end. If you look at my component, it's really 1 or 2 lines of code to subscribe to the observable. And in the service itself, it's really same thing, 1 or 2 lines of code to just create a WebSocket and then return an observable that we can subscribe to. And this makes our component reactive. My component keeps receiving data, so there's more and more that gets added to the list. And this component now has dozens of different posts that were pushed to the array of data that gets displayed here. So that's an example of observable. We subscribe to it, we get the data, we display it. So a way to think about observables is to see them as a newspaper subscription. When you subscribe to a newspaper or a magazine, you expect to receive several issues over time. You're going to get 1 newspaper, 2 newspapers. If you subscribe for 1 year, you're going to receive them 1 year, and then it's going to stop. With observables, it's exactly the same idea. Now, when you subscribe to a newspaper or a magazine, it is going to be delivered at a specific location. And that's the address we give when we subscribe. With RxJS, when we subscribe, we are passing a callback function. And that callback function is the equivalent of the address. That's where the data is going to be delivered in our code, so we can deal with it. We can handle the data and do what we have to do with it. And of course, this subscription is probably going to complete at some point. So it could be after a given number of months for a newspaper. In the case of our code, it could be that the subscription is going to stay there as long as the component is rendered on the screen. And if the component is removed because we are moving to a different page or the application gets closed, then of course we would get rid of that subscription. So the nice thing with observables is that we can create them out of any DOM event in JavaScript. So in this example here on the screen, I'm creating an observable out of any click event that happens on my document. So that's what this does. The from event function also comes from RxJS. I import it, and then I create an observable out of any click that happens on my document. And then I subscribe to that observable, and every time someone clicks on the page, it would trigger that event, and the subscription would receive something. So observables, we can create them manually. In 2 previous examples, we would get an observable from the from event function, and that would create an observable out of DOM events. The previous example would use a WebSocket to create an observable, but if we want to create our own mechanism to publish information, you can do that using specific objects that you would create yourself. And when we subscribe to an observable, we saw so far that we can register 1 callback to get the data, but you can also register 2 more callbacks. One to get errors. So if anything goes wrong, that would fall into that callback function. So you could handle that error. And another one to handle whenever the subscription completes. So you can pass up to 3 callback functions to your subscribe method. And if I want to create my own observable, I can do so easily by using the new observable constructor. And that constructor expects a function as a parameter. The function takes an observer as a parameter. And with that observer, we can do 3 things. We have 3 methods that we can call. Next, and that's to return the next value to all of the subscribers. Complete, that's to complete the subscription and say, okay, we just emitted everything we had to emit. The subscription is now completed. And error if any error occurs in the process. So let's give this a try. And I'm going to show you a different example. So in this code, I'm going to create my own observable. That's what I do right here, creating an observable of string and passing the function that's going to do something. And that function, what I'm doing here is I'm using setInterval to emit data every 2 seconds. So setInterval is just a regular JavaScript function that you can use to run some code at a given interval. In that case, every 2 seconds, we are going to use the observer to emit a new value. So it's going to be Eureka and an index that I keep increasing. And then I'm going to log the information, the observer was created. I'm going to subscribe to it. And what I do in my subscribe is that whenever I get a message, I'm going to add it to an array and log I got data from the observable with that data. So let's take a look at that in action. So that's my observable. You can see that it is running. And every 2 seconds, I'm getting new data. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and it keeps increasing. So this time, I'm not connected to a WebSocket. I'm not connected to a backend or anything. It is just a local observable that I created and that keeps emitting data that we render on the screen. Easy enough. So you can create your own observables. You can use observables created for you by the RXJS library. And all of that is going to allow us to make our code reactive. And on top of all of these features, on top of having a way to subscribe and get data from an observable, the RxJS library gives us many more things. And one of these very interesting things that we get is the notion of operator. So an operator, what it is that it is a pure function that takes an observable and that returns a modified observable out of it. So what this means is that you can get your stream of data, apply some transformations to it, and get a new observable as a result that you can subscribe to. So an example down here is the map operator. And this map operator, we apply it to an input observable that emits 1, 2, 3. And once you have applied the map operator, you can see that the resulting observable out of this is a new observable that gets the values 10, 20, and 30. That's because map just takes every single value and returns 10 times that value. So that's an example of RxJS operator that's just going to get the data from our observable, change it, and return a new way to deal with that data. So if I go back to my example of list post component here, something I could do is that instead of getting all of the posts, let's assume that I'm only interested in getting the emails. I just want to get the email address of every single poster from this social media. So what I'm going to do is use an operator, map, the operator that we just saw. And for each post, it's just going to extract the email address. And that's all we're going to do. So get posts is the same observable as the one we saw earlier up there. But this time, instead of directly subscribing to it, we are using the pipe function that allows us to use multiple operators. In that case, just one. That's going to change that observable, create a new one that only has emails. And then when I subscribe to that result, what I'm getting now is not a list of posts anymore, but emails that are getting emitted one by one. So I'm going to change my code here so that we subscribe to our email stream now for the next few, for this example. And as I do this, let's go back to the demo and the social media posts. And now what we are getting is email addresses. Instead of receiving the entire post, we are just getting the email address. And that's because we change our subscription using operators to tweak what we're getting and extract just the email address out of the observable. So that's very powerful because with just one line of code, really in that case, I'm changing the stream of data that I receive to just use what I actually need. So RxJS comes with hundreds of different operators. And if you have a hard time understanding what operators do, back to my newspaper example or magazine example, when we subscribe to a newspaper or a magazine, we expect to receive several issues over time. But most of the time, we never read the entire thing. Some people are going to be interested in just the coupons page inside those magazines or newspapers. Some will just read the sports news or some specific kinds of articles out of it. And that's what operators do, really. They take our subscription and then they adapt it to our needs. So we only get the data that we are really interested in. So operators are kind of the filter that you're going to apply to your subscription to make it fit what you are expecting out of it. So operators in RxJS can filter some data, aggregate information, and do all of these kinds of different things. So I'm going to show you a couple more examples of observables, of operators. One of them is max, for instance. So max is a math operator, and the idea is that it's only going to return one value. So assume that we have an input observable that's going to emit multiple different numbers over time and then complete. So it emits 2, 30, 22, 5, 60, and 1. Then it completes. The max operator is just going to wait for the completion of the observable and then emit the maximum value that was ever emitted here, which in that case is 60. So that's a very helpful operator that can be used in multiple different contexts. Another example of operator is merge. So merge takes two different operators, two different observables, and is going to merge them into one. So if you have multiple different data sources, let's say in my example, for instance, I could have a subscription to Facebook posts and a subscription to Twitter posts. And I would subscribe to these two different sources, merge them into just one observable. And when I subscribe to that observable, I would get data from both Facebook and Twitter, for instance. So that's an example of use case for the merge operator. Filter is another example of such operator. So filter, of course, is a filtering operator, as the name tells us. And assuming we have a list of numbers emitted here, filter would only keep the values that are greater than 10 in that example, which means that the resulting subscription only gets 30, 22, and 60. And all of the values that are less than 10 don't pass through that filter. So that's something I can also illustrate in my posts example. And I could add another operator here and say that what I'm going to do is filter all of the emails I get. And let's say that I'm only interested in emails that start with the letter A. And I'm going to do uppercase A because I know that this subscription is getting some of them. So now we're getting all of the posts still, but my operators are going to tweak that, so we only extract the emails out of them, and then we filter to only keep the emails that start with the letter A. So let's see the result in here, and now you can see that all of the emails we are getting start with uppercase A. And there's probably more data being emitted in the background, but we just ignore it and only keep the email addresses that start with the letter A. And this is also achieved with the simple use of one RXJS operator. So it's really, really powerful and really easy to put in place. So we saw a bunch of different use cases, different scenarios where we had some reactive code, we would subscribe to it, get the data, then apply some operators to make everything reactive. I'm going to get to the next step now and show something even more reactive, where we actually rely on both a data source and some user input to achieve the behavior that you can see on the screen right now. So we have a list of states from the United States. And as the user enters or removes character in the filter input, we would display or hide all of the states that match the filter condition here. So if the type C, then all of the states that have a C in it show up, and if the type CAL, then only California shows up. That's the idea of this. So this example can be found at the following URL. So I'm going to go there on StackBlitz. So this is available online. It's all open source. You can access it, tweak it, and use it as an example for your own code if you ever want to do that. No problem at all. So that's the example on the right-hand side. You can see that we have the list of all of the states. And if I type the letter C, now I'm only getting all of the ones that have a C in it. If I type, let's say, CO, then Colorado, Connecticut, and District of Columbia. COL, only Colorado and Columbia, and COLO, only Colorado. And if I remove some characters, then all of the states come back. So the code to achieve all of this, that's all there is. I was able to achieve this with just 6 lines of code using RxJS and operators. So that's how powerful it is. That's how easy it is to achieve reactive behaviors with just a combination of different operators and observables. So how is it done? Let's go through that example line by line. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm getting my list of states. So I have an array of states that is out in the application, but just to simulate a real life application, I turn that into an observable using the off function. So states here is an observable of state that has all of the 50 states in it. This list could come from a HTTP request, it could come from a WebSocket, anything really. As long as it is an observable, anything would do. Then I'm creating the form control. So that's the input where we enter the data. And what I'm going to do is subscribe to any changes in the values entered in that input. So this gives me an observable that I can subscribe to get notified whenever the value of the filter changes. What I do is that in order to initialize the process and make sure that I get a default value, I use a specific operator for that called start with. And I say that we start with empty, so that by default, we just don't filter by anything. We just start with an empty filter. And this creates the observable called filter observable here. And once I have these two observables, I'm going to combine them using combine latest. Combine latest is another function, another operator from RxJS that takes many different observables, as many as you want, and combines them into one. So what happens when you combine all of these observables together, so I just pass them as a parameter, and then when you subscribe to that, you're getting an array of values. And the value, so the last value of the first observable would be the first value in that array. The second value from that observable would be the second value of that array, and so forth. So if I have 10 different subscriptions, 10 different observables, I would always receive an array of 10 values, and those 10 values are the latest values emitted by those observables. And so what I do now is that I know that every time I'm going to filter, and every time I'm going to type a new character, filter string here is going to get updated with the value entered in that filter. States is going to be my list of states, of course. So I use the JavaScript filter function for arrays, states.filter. And I'm just checking that our state has the filter string inside of its name. So state.name index of filter string different from -1, which means that the state name contains the filter string. And that's it. That's all I have to do. Now that code is completely reactive, and my component template is going to display the list of states from this new observable, filtered states. So that's a list that shows up on the right-hand side. And as I type some filtering criteria in here, for instance, K, it's going to go through, so it's going to emit a new value in the filter observable subscription that's going to be passed inside that operator and filter the list of states to just return Kansas and Kentucky in that case. So that's how we make our code reactive, and that's how a combination of different operators and observables can achieve a lot with very little code, with very efficient code. So that's all of the examples I wanted to demo today. So what we are going to do now is, if you have any questions, you can use the chat section in the webinar to ask those questions, or you can just unmute yourself and ask me if you have any question about all of this. The slides are available at the URL that you can see there. My email is there too. If you want to email me questions later on, feel free to do so. I'll be happy to answer. My Twitter handle is here, the URL of my blog as well. And yeah, that's all of the different ways that you can reach out to me or subscribe to my blog to get more content over time. So now, if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead, and we'll do a quick Q&A. And if there is no question, then I guess we are good to go. All right, so I don't see any questions popping up. So what I'm going to do is close this webinar for today. Thanks a lot for attending. And again, if you have any follow-up questions or if you need more info, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is here on the screen. Thanks a lot for attending, and feel free to join one of our next webinars.